senators. I see that we have quorum, and I declare the meeting in session. I wish to welcome all of you and our viewers across the country who may be watching on sendcanada.ca to the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting today in the Senate of Canada building, which is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. My name is Brian Francis. I'm a senator from Etobicoke, also known as Prince Edward Island, and I'm the chair of the committee. I would like to introduce the members of the committee who are participating in this meeting today. Senator Daniel Christmas from Nova Scotia, Senator Dennis Glenn Patterson from Nunavut, Senator David M. Arnott from Saskatchewan, Senator Michelle Adet will be here shortly. She's just running a little late. Senator Patrick Brazeau from Quebec, Senator Mary Coyle from Nova Scotia, Senator Nancy J. Hartling from New Brunswick, and Senator Kim Tate from Ontario. Today we are starting a study on the implementation of an act to amend the Indian Act in response to the Superior Court of Quebec decision and Desjardins versus Canada, previously known as Bill S3. I would like to introduce our first panel of witnesses. With us today, we have Sharon McIvor, Shelagh Day, Chair, Human Rights Committee and co-founder of the Canadian Feminist Alliance from International Action, and Dr. Pam Palmer, Chair in Indigenous Governance from Ryerson University. Ms. McIvor, Ms. Day, and Dr. Palmer will be providing opening remarks of up to 5 minutes each. We will then move to a question and answer session of approximately 4 minutes per senator. Please note that I will let witnesses know when they have 30 seconds left on their allocated time. I ask senators who have a question to use the raise hand feature on Zoom to signal this to the clerk. They will then be acknowledged in the chat. A reminder that committee members will be given priority to ask questions. I will now ask Ms. McIvor to begin her opening remarks. You're muted, Ms. McIvor.
Can start my time again.
Yes, I will.
Thank you to the committee for the invitation to appear today and for your work. Because of the amendment to Bill S3 made by the committee under the leadership of Senator Lillian Dick and the commitment of the senator as a whole, the central core of the pre-1985 sex discrimination was removed from the Indian Act. As you know, getting the 61A all the way amendment was a fight, and getting it actually promulgated on August the 15th, 2019, long after the other provisions of Bill S3 was another fight. Now we're trying to get this amendment actually implemented so that it can make the difference in the lives of First Nations women and their descendants that we all intended. We're trying to ensure that the residual discrimination is repaired, the remaining discrimination is removed, and reparations for the harms caused are provided. It is our hope that the committee will take up the matter of Indian Act discrimination once more to help us make equality for First Nations women and their descendants fact, not just words. My colleagues and I have 5 points to make today. 1, in order for women and their descendants to enjoy the benefits of the 2019 Bill S3 amendment, they have to be registered. By the government's own estimate, there are between 270,000 and 450,000 who are newly eligible. But as of November 2021, only about 22,000 were registered. In short, registrations of those entitled under the 61A all the way amendment is not really happening, which means that so far the amendment has little meaning. 2, the profound and long-lasting residual effects of sex discrimination on band membership, treaty rights, political participation, voice, culture, language, and access to programs and benefits have not been addressed, nor is there any apparent plan for doing so. There is no plan for reparations for the profound harms of the discrimination, apology, memorialization, compensation, or public education. 4, contrary to the claim of the report, there are outstanding issues of sex discrimination in the Indian Act, including the lingering effect of automatic enfranchisement on the wives and children of men who are enfranchised, and the discrimination inherent in the unstated and unknown paternity provision. The Government of Canada has obligations under UNDRIP to provide effective redress for any form of forced assimilation that violates the rights of Indigenous people. Canada is committed to making a plan for the implementation of UNDRIP in Canada and needs urgently to address the registration of women and repair the harms done. So, in March 2022, after 50 years of struggle by First Nations women to end the sex discrimination in the Indian Act, where are we? It must be said for the record that the sex discrimination in Canada's Indian Act is a key component of genocide identified by the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, because it is a tool of forced assimilation. The Indian Act has defined thousands of Indigenous women and their descendants as non-Indians and forced them into the non-Indigenous population. The sex discrimination has also stripped First Nations women of thousands of, let's try this again, has stripped First Nations of thousands of women and their descendants, shrinking the pool of Indians who are recognized as having inherent Aboriginal treaty and land rights. The sex discrimination has worked effectively to damage the women and the nations. The fact that there are somewhere between 270,000 and 450,000 women and their descendants who are newly entitled to status by the August 2019 amendment proves just how effective the tool of assimilation, the sex discrimination has been, since there are only a few more than 1 million status Indians in Canada now. The government indicates in this report that it wishes to be on the path to getting out of the business of Indian registration. However, we wish to make it clear that if the government gets out of the business of Indian registration before it restores the women and their descendants to their rightful status and membership in their communities, it will cement in place the discrimination and its effect for all time. This is not the path to reconciliation.
Thank you, Ms. McIvor. I will now ask Ms. Day to begin her opening remarks. You're on mute, Ms. Day.
There, I hope you can hear me now.
We can hear you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to appear. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I want to talk today about registration, the facts, the problems, and the way to fix them. As Ms. McIvor has already said, the Government of Canada estimates between 270,000 and 450,000 First Nations women and their descendants are newly eligible for status because of the August 2019 amendment. But as of November 2021, only about 21,000 had been processed. And we note that this 21,000 includes all those registered under Bill S3 since December 2017, not specifically those registered under the 2019 61A all the way amendment. Indigenous Services Canada reports that it's now processing 1,600 applications a month under Bill S3. At this rate, we calculate that it will take between 14 and 23 years for the newly eligible to be registered. I'm sure that the senators can agree that this is wholly unacceptable. We have urged the government to aspire not just to a rate of processing that is faster, but one that will ensure achievement of a just goal, that is full registration of all those eligible under S3 by December 2025. To do this, it will be necessary to process at least 100,000 applications per year. We note that many of the women who are newly eligible for status are elderly, and the benefit and promise of S3 will be betrayed if they die before being registered. Also, whether it's because of age or other cause, many newly eligible persons have disabilities and urgently need the health and other benefits that come with status. Delay in getting registered exacerbates harm during these days of pandemic. Here's what needs to be fixed. Indigenous Services Canada needs to hire and train enough people to actually register the women and their descendants who are eligible. The application process needs to be completely revamped to remove the delays and obstacles. Anyone can get a Canadian passport in 10 to 20 business days, but processing applications for Indian status takes 6 months to 2 years or more. This is inexcusable. The application process is notoriously difficult. Applicants need navigation assistance and legal and paralegal supports to prepare correctly and to see their applications through the process. There must be an effective communications plan to increase public awareness of Bill S3 and to actively encourage women and their descendants to apply for the status to which they are entitled. This campaign must be bold, inventive, and fresh. Messages need to be simple, stories need to be told to illustrate who is now eligible. Finally, the government needs to implement the recommendations made by Claudette Dumont-Smith in her 2019 report to Minister Bennett about the funding that will be necessary to support the reconnection of women and their descendants to their communities. We have provided goals and timetables for the registration of the newly eligible to Minister Haidu and sent a request to Minister Freeland to ask that she include adequate funds in budget 2022 to ensure that the newly eligible women and their descendants can be registered by December 2025. Thanks to the work of this committee and to the incredible dedication of many First Nations women, including Sharon McIvor, Sandra Lovelace Nicholas, and Lillian Dick, who are in this meeting today, the core of the sex discrimination has been removed from the face of the law, but there is no implementation, and in fact, the discrimination continues. This is a massive violation of the equality rights of First Nations women, almost 150 years long, a root cause of lasting damage and high rates of violence and death, repeatedly censured by courts and human rights bodies, and still we have no effective remedy. We have no acknowledgement yet from the Government of Canada of the extent, scope, and damage caused by this discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Day. I will now ask Dr. Palmater to begin her opening remarks.
Thank you, and you can still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfectly. Kwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation, an unceded Mi'kma'ki, and my home community is Ugbaganjig, which is Eel River Bar First Nation. I have been, today I'm coming to you from the sovereign territories of Mississaugas of Scugog. In terms of how I relate to this issue, I've been a lawyer in good standing for 23 years, 10 of which I did at Justice Canada and Indian Affairs, and I did my doctorate in law and sex and race discrimination in the Indian Act. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I endorse the submissions of my colleagues ahead of me. You already know the political history of well over 100 years of First Nations women and children being targeted for exclusion from their communities, a purposeful genocidal attempt to destroy Native communities. You know about the First Nation matriarchs who spent decades challenging this. Senator Sandra Lovelace Nicholas and Sharon McIvor, just to name a few. And you know all of the court cases that found this to be discrimination and all of the inquiries, commissions, and reports that have found this to be discrimination that led to the amendments under S3. Yet, as my colleagues have said, the remedy that was intended by Bill S3 is being withheld to thousands of First Nation women and children through Canada's ongoing failure to register them. There's only a small number, 250,000 to 400,000 of registrants newly entitled, but it's taking sometimes over 2 years to get registered. Yet there's over 4 million passports processed every year, and the service standard can be as little as 10 days. Canada also processes more than 400,000 immigrants each year. There is something horribly wrong with this ongoing discrimination against Indigenous women. And of course, we know as the discrimination continues, this violates Indigenous laws, treaties, the Charter rights, Section 35 rights, and international human rights laws. And this brings us to Bill C-15, which confirms that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has applicability in Canadian law. And these are minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. And it demands equality between men and women and particular attention being given to the needs of women. It also prohibits genocide, forced assimilation, and protects our right to belong to our communities. Now, let's lay UNDRIP over Canada's Indian Act registration provisions, including S3, and see if it would survive a basic human rights test. And I think the answer is clearly no. Despite the S3 amendments, the significant delays by the federal government means there are significant impacts to First Nation women and children. The discrimination continues. It sends a horrible message to society and First Nations that First Nation women are less valuable, less worthy, less Indigenous, and less deserving of urgent action. It perpetuates divisions in our communities. It prolongs disconnections. It creates barriers to access language and culture. It denies First Nation women and children a political voice in the governance of their First Nations. They are excluded from negotiations or referendums on rights. They're outright denied their treaty rights, and many have been unable to access First Nation specific pandemic supports. That is a crisis. But most importantly, it impacts their sense of self-worth and identity. And that directly impacts their physical, mental, and emotional health. This is forced assimilation. This is the core of Canada's genocide. Some of the recommendations are to comply with the United Nations human rights decision in McIvor, which says to end current discrimination, prevent future discrimination, and make reparations for historic discrimination. That means Canada needs to act with haste to register all of the newly entitled. And I think that we should have a service standard no less than that of passports. There should be a 20-day service standard. There should be no expiry date on Indian status, as is with our cards. We need to eliminate all sex discrimination in Indian registration that remains. We must address band membership, and we must repeal the non-liability clauses in S3 and C3 so that we can make reparations. An apology, a memorial, support for Indigenous women's organizations, and compensation for the many generations of discrimination. Anything less continues and compounds discrimination. It is illegal, unjust, and unconscionable. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Palmer. We will now begin the question and answer session. I defer first to Deputy Chair, Senator Christmas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very, very much for putting the spotlight on S3. I would like to pose my first question to Dr. Palmer, and I want to pick up on the last point. I know you sort of ran out of time with your remarks, but I thought your last point was very, very instructive. You mentioned that S3, that we should repeal the non-liability clause. And I haven't heard this very much, but there is an apology deserving to the women who lost their rights. A consideration should be made about a memorial for those who have lost their rights and compensation. Dr. Palmer, could you elaborate on those 4 items and why they should be considered by the committee?
Thank you for the question. It is incredibly important for a multitude of reasons. By Canada standing up in Parliament, like it did for residential schools, and saying, here's what we did to First Nations women and children. Our intention wasn't just to assimilate them, it was to destroy First Nation communities. These women had no choice. It wasn't their fault. They're not to be blamed for any of this. And Canada owes an incredible amount for all of the personal damage that's been caused to women and children and communities and the current problems. That's the kind of apology that's needed. And the memorial to all of these women, Senator Sandra Lovelace-Nicholas and Sharon McIvor, are literally like my grandmothers. I only got registered because of Sandra Lovelace-Nicholas and Sharon McIvor's cases. My grandmother, my father, myself, and my children owe us being here talking about this to their endless efforts, but they've spent their lifetime. Perhaps they would have wanted to spend their lifetime doing other things. And we need to start remembering, acknowledging, and honoring people in their lifetime, not after they're passed away. And compensation goes without saying. There's compensation for residential schools, colonization, for 60 scoop forced adoptions, for the foster care crisis, for forced relocations, you name it. There is compensation ongoing or in the process. Why on earth would we send the message to Canada that First Nations women and children are not deserving of compensation for clear and purposeful violations of their basic human rights? And I think that's why it's so important that we talk about real reparations.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'd like to have a supplementary if I can.
Yes, you may.
Thank you. I'll ask this question to any of the panelists if you wish to answer. I haven't heard much discussion since S3 about the 2-generation cutoff that's inherent within the Indian Act. Now, if I remember correctly, when we were debating S3, there was a lot of discussion about the Crown engaging First Nations peoples on the double generation cutoff, the 2-generation cutoff. Could you explain to the committee and to our listening audience what that is and why it is so important that the Crown address that issue now?
And who was that directed at? Sorry.
I would direct it to any of the panelists.
Oh, would you like to speak to that, Sharon?
No, why don't you, Pam? We
Okay.
know the same stuff, so you may as well say it.
Thank you. Well, the Section 6.2 cutoff is basically something that was enacted in 1985. We feel in retaliation for having to reinstate all of the First Nations women that they had kicked out of communities to find a way to continue the legislative extinction and forced assimilation of First Nations, because that's exactly what it results in. 6.2, the 2nd-generation cutoff, relates to outparenting, parenting with a non-registered person. So you combine that with the high rates of outparenting in First Nations, because our First Nation communities were divided up and separated and put into smaller areas. So we're intermarried with our treaty partners, we work with our treaty partners, but we're punished for it. And it means that every First Nation in this country has a legislated extinction date that you can calculate based on their birth, death, and outparenting, and Section 6.2 of the Indian Act. And Canada continues in every court case to defend this formula over and over, even at the United Nations. And I don't know how on earth you can claim to stand up for human rights and defend the legislative right to legislate Indians out of existence. And that's exactly what 6.2 does. Canada has heard throughout many, many years, decades now of engagement with First Nations and Indigenous women that we want to get rid of Section 6.2 of the Indian Act. On a go-forward basis, why should we be cutting off our children? That would mean my grandchildren could not be a member of the Mi'kmaq community, even though they will grow up in the culture and the language and the community. That's absolutely unconscionable. It's forced assimilation and a part of ongoing genocide.
Thank you, Dr. Palmer. Ms. Day, did you want to comment on that? Well, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to pass the chair back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Christmas. I have a statement and then a question on behalf of Senator Patterson, who left his hearing protectors here. So, and these are his words. Thanks for the very clear testimony you have all given us today. It's alarming and timely, Ms. Day. You have given us clear recommendations, which I think the committee should immediately adopt and forward to the responsible minister. Question for you, Ms. Day. Ms. Day, you have suggested that the Department of ISK should train and hire enough people to accelerate the application rate from 600 to 100,000 per year. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, you did. The goals and timetables that we sent to Minister Haidu and also to Minister Freeland recommend that we get the 450 up to 450,000 women and their descendants registered by December 2025. That means 100,000 per year. That means increasing the resources. It also means a big public education campaign. Indigenous Services Canada needs to go out and say, Dr. Palmer has said, this is what's happened. This is what we've done. And now we're going to repair it. And the message needs to be very well communicated to everyone in the country that this is the repair process means that people can think about whether or not they are among those who are eligible. So we need a big public education campaign. We need resources. We need navigation help. There's a big job to do here, but we cannot think that we're on the path to reconciliation unless Canada is prepared to do this. This is the way to unwind the terrible damage that's been done to women, First Nations women and their children, and to First Nations by stripping them of members.
Thank you for that. And a supplementary on behalf of Senator Patterson. Could you please share with the committee, through the clerk, you or your colleagues' letters to Ministers Freeland and Minister Hajdu calling for action on this neglected commitment?
Yes, we have done that. We've sent to the committee clerk copies of those letters, and we're very happy to provide all of the information that we have to committee members. We've been in communication, a group of First Nations women leaders, First Nations women's organizations, and allies have been in communication with the Indigenous Services Canada on a consistent basis over the last several years about implementation of Bill S3. We're happy to provide the committee with all of the correspondence and notes from that communication back and forth.
Thank you, Ms. Day. I'll go to Senator Brazeau and then Senator Coyle.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being with us this afternoon. And Ms. McIvor, Ms. Day, and Dr. Palmer, I would like to Certainly, thank you for all your tireless work and advocacy on this issue, because it remains and is very important for First Nations people going forward. We often mention the fact that it's still the government of Canada and still the Minister of Indian Affairs that decides in Canada who is and who is not a status First Nations person. And so, having said that, and we all know how long it takes time, the process it takes for the registration process. And just as an aside, I've been working with an individual who, for the last 6 years, on trying to get his status, and it's very mind-boggling as to what exactly the department utilizes in terms of criteria to determine whose status and whose status. But I digress. So my question would be for any of you, what do you think it will take so that we are in a position in Canada where those deciding who's First Nations citizens are actually First Nations people, or the nations themselves, as opposed to a department that is very secretive about what exactly they do in terms of the registration process? Thank you.
I will answer part of this. Thank you for the question, Senator Brazo. The position that many of us women who've been discriminated against has taken over the years is the fact that we were not involved in our communities because of the legislation. And we need the government of Canada to rectify that. So all of us that were discriminated against and lost contact with our communities, lost ability to be in participation in our communities, they've got to put us back. What they've said with membership, for instance, because as you know, in 1985, they gave the various Indian bands the right to make their own membership codes. And many cannot get back into their birth bands. They were automatically transferred to other bands. So they can't get back into their birth bands, and then the descendants can. And so you're talking, I think what you're alluding to is the fact that should not the First Nations be making the decisions about who are their members? And there are those of us who agree with that, but not until they clean it up. Because today, if you want to apply to get back to your birth band, it's up to the band to do it. And Canada just took their hands away from all of those First Nations women who were automatically transferred when they married an Indian from another band, and they left them there. And there are a lot of women who've been in contact with me. They want to go back to their birth bands. They can't. Their band will not let them in. So what we're saying is that Canada's got to clean up the mess. They transferred them. They should have allowed them to transfer back, or provide a mechanism where they had the right to transfer back. It wasn't somebody else's decision. So yes, I believe that self-determination, as covered under the various legislations, including UNDRIP, should be the right of the community. But they've got to put us back because we have the right to belong to our communities. And people in the community today shouldn't decide whether we can exercise that right or not.
Senator Coyle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Wow, here we are again. Thank you so much, Ms. Day, Ms. McIvor, and Dr. Palmater. I'm glad you didn't mince words here. It's clear that from what we're hearing from you, and of course that has been brought to our attention, that's why we're meeting on this now, that, you know, we have to, as you have said, make this, you know, very important decision into fact, not just words. And we have to get a way of improving this registration process, because it is it is a real shame. It's you know, it's furthering, as you said, Dr. Palmater, perpetuating the discrimination and the divisions. And there is no reason why we should not be insisting on a service standard that is respectable, that is reasonable, and obviously we're nowhere near that right now. And aligning it with the passport application standard, you know, on the surface sounds like a reasonable one to me. Now, I have a question. So I'm fully supportive and agree that our committee should take this up and with the minister and move this forward. In addition to that, though, I want to understand some of the finer points. And Ms. McIvor, you've started to talk about some of it, and you mentioned something. So I have two questions. One for Ms. McIvor, and you spoke about reparations for the harm that has been caused, and there's such a variety of harms. I'd like to hear about that and what reparations are being looked for. And then Ms. Day, you spoke about the need to implement the recommendations regarding funding to reconnect women and their descendants with the communities. And again, that's something that Ms. McIvor was talking about as well. You know, what does that look like? That's got to be absolutely critical. So I'd like to hear about both of those things, the reparations and the reconnections, if I could, please.
Go ahead, Sheila.
Well, let me just talk about the reconnection. You'll be aware, Senator Coyle, that in the report that Claudette Dumont-Smith made to the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations in 2019, she made a series of recommendations, including, I might say, about getting on with dealing with 6-2, which is such a big problem. But she said quite clearly, in order for the communities to feel as though they can reconnect with new members, they need to have the funding that's provided to them and the formulas for funding changed, ameliorated, increased. And she made very specific recommendations about, you know, what those funding allocations are. And so those recommendations need to be implemented. It's part of this. As both Sharon and Pam have said so eloquently, the problem that we're facing is not just that the women aren't registered, it's that with registration goes so many other things: connection to community band, membership, treaty rights, recognition that they're holders of Aboriginal rights, recognition that they have a voice with respect to what should happen with their community or with self-government. If they're not back reconnected, they don't get to say about self-government and what that should look like for their community. So that question of reconnection is a huge one in this picture. And it's the reason why we say registration, reconnection, reparations, get the rest of the discrimination out of the Indian Act, and recognize that what we have here is forced assimilation and we have to reverse it. That's what we're looking at.
Senator Hartley. Go ahead, Ms. McIvor.
Okay.
Second part of my question.
I just wanted to add that the women who were married out and forced out, in many instances, most instances, have all the things that go along with discrimination. They're living in poverty. They've lived in poverty. We've got a couple of registrations lately where senior women weren't getting medical care, all of that, that's all covered once you've got a status number. And they were able to improve their quality of life. But many of the women who were married out and then sort of fell along the wayside are living in extreme poverty, and their children are and grandchildren are living in extreme poverty. And if you talk about well, what did well my son lose, for instance, because he wasn't registered until very late. Um, he didn't have the opportunity to do post-secondary. He had the ability to do it. He didn't have the opportunity to do it. And today he's working and earning a living. But so there were all those sorts of things that they lost out on. And many of them are living in poverty. I'm one of the fortunate ones that were able to get along a little better than the rest. But because of the discrimination, they are still living in poverty. And they're because of a whole lot of other things, the discrimination and that they haven't had the ability to actually have a life that is beyond making a hand to mouth, and a lot of medical stuff, lots of um, they have lots of illnesses that aren't being taken care of, and a lot of it dental, for instance. Many of them don't have any dental, many of them don't have any teeth, and on all of that, that there's a whole bunch of things that they lost because of the discrimination, and they should be able to get some reparation for it.
Thank you, Ms. McIvor. Senator Hartling.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for your wonderful presentation, so well crafted with such great ideas. As I'm sitting listening to this, I'm starting to get very disturbed. I feel like my blood pressure just went up. And I remember when S3 was passed in the Senate, and we were all very excited about that. And now to come back to this, it feels as if there's a discrimination here and oppression and gender-based for sure. And I just I can't believe that this can move this slowly, because if something needs to move quickly, as you know, in government, it can be moved. So this is really certainly discrimination. So I guess I'm thinking like, for people that are waiting, the pandemic has been difficult and they must find it even more difficult. And I'm just wondering, what is the real holdup here? What do you think the real holdup is? And if you could envision this happening quicker, and we could look at some of these parts that you suggested, the reparations and reconciliation. What does that look like? What do you see this looking like, so that we can certainly and truly support this, because it needs to go forward? And whoever would like to answer, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you very much for your continued work.
I will answer really quickly, but I think Pam, I'd like Pam to get in on this conversation. It's will. We've been putting pressure on the government officials, in particularly those within Indian Affairs, to get the information out. I, on a regular basis, will talk to somebody and they will say, well, I have First Nations ancestry. And I say, okay, like what? And they'll tell me, I said, okay, well, this and this and this. Yeah. Well, you're eligible for under the latest legislation, you're eligible for registration. What? I didn't know that. How do I find that out? And how do I start? And there's absolutely no information out there about telling them that if you had, because of the August 2019 amendment, if you've got one female ancestor that married out at any time, you're eligible. And it's not out there. And we've been putting pressure on them. So that's the one thing I'm going to say. Over to you, Pam.
Thanks, Sharon. This is a really important question. I think this is the question that people actually avoid. Because when you ask the why, you have to start looking at sexism, racism, and problems that Indian Affairs, or whatever it's called now, has long held in the bureaucracy. We know the problems that they're having amongst their own employees, and there's still this block to changing any of this stuff. And what Sharon has said, since before S3 passed and since S3 passed, We have had meeting after meeting after meeting with Minister Miller and Bennett and Monsef, and we've sent numerous letters and we've done everything they've asked. We've followed up. Here's the information. And it's always met with thank you for your long advocacy. Thank you for your efforts. You're so commendable. You're wonderful women. And then there's no action. And so, and I don't want to make this sound like this is a liberal government issue. This is obviously for every federal government that's ever been, but we're at a stage where this government promises nation to nation. It's implemented UNDRIP. It claims to be, promoting women's rights, except Indigenous women. And I think you can look at all of the issues they have acted on, important issues on Indigenous things, but then look at the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing. Genocide in this country, and we don't have a genocide response. That goes to show you just how much Indigenous women and girls are undervalued. And also in my experience, and this is anecdotal, but I work with First Nations all across the country and First Nation organizations, and they constantly are coming to me for the correct information. Departmental bureaucrats are going out saying, oh, you don't want to bring these women back. I mean, millions of people will be added. You'll be overwhelmed. You won't be able to govern. You won't have enough housing. And I have to go there and say, that's a complete lie. Literally 22,000 people have been registered. It's a drop in the bucket. But that being said, Canada is racing to sign 10-year block funding contribution agreements without women included. They're racing to sign education agreements without women included. What they're doing without First Nations knowing is that they're going to prejudice First Nations in terms of per capita and other infrastructure that they won't get money for, and they'll lock themselves in without the ability to change those funds later on. And Canada's doing that knowingly and purposefully, and I think that's got to be really addressed.
Thank you, Dr. Palmer. Senator Pate.
Thank you very much, and thank you to each of you for the incredible work you did. I don't want to sound like the others you've talked to in the government who say those things. It's been decades of trying to get to this place. Just for those of you who are with us today, there's two questions. I want to pick up on Dr. Palmer, what you were just talking about in terms of the implications of this, that it strikes me as you were talking and as Professor McIvor were talking about the implications of these policies. An area that I know well, of course, is within the prison and corrections field, an example of where in 1992, a law was passed that was supposed to provide off-ramps out of the system for Indigenous people. No communities were told about it. And then the fact that nobody applied for it was used as an example for why we didn't need to see these kinds of provisions, and allowed for corrections to significantly hamper the development of things like Section 81 and 84 agreements. It strikes me, as you've said, we've accepted, Canada has taken on that we will implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the calls for justice of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the calls to action and the calls for justice of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Could you highlight, just to be even more crystal clear, how this is in direct contravention with those agreements that have been taken on by this government, those commitments that have been taken on by this government? And then secondly, if I may, Mr. Chair, for Professor McIvor, you have a case before the UN Human Rights Committee, have had it going for, I think it's about 12 years now. How does that case relate to these provisions, and what is the impact of Canada's ongoing failure to act with respect to S3, and what's likely to come out of the, if you can speculate, from the UN Human Rights Committee?
Thank you for the question, Senator Pate, and obviously thank you for the work that you've done on this committee on addressing prison injustice and this issue with Indian registration, which also these two things go together, because women in prison are not getting the support they need to be able to register under the Indian Act, or have their children with whom they're now separated to register under the Indian Act. So when we talk about discrimination, we are not talking about the card. We are talking about all of the implications of not being registered and the multiple levels of discrimination that you experience. So living in poverty because you don't have access to those programs and services, being unhealthy because of those programs and services, not like all of it's worse. But here's what Canada's doing by allowing this to happen. It's saying we have the law, but you don't get the protection of it. That's no different than murdered and missing Indigenous women. Do you remember when there were women trying to advocate to make the murder of Indigenous women like extra bad? Like it's not just murder, it's like double murder and you should be doubly punished for it. That's because what people were doing is trying to reach out and say, what law do we have to pass that you're actually going to allow us to enjoy? You know, and so what they're doing is they could pass 100 more laws, make 100 more amendments, but if they don't register people, then they suffer from the discrimination. And this is trauma, and it's intergenerational trauma, and it's added to all of the violence, all of the other discrimination in healthcare and education and housing and homelessness. And who's reaching out to the Indigenous women who live in the downtown East Side on the streets, trying to register them and get them help? It's definitely not the federal government. And so they're breaking Indigenous laws because Indigenous laws respect women. They're breaking treaties because our treaties are supposed to go to our heirs and heirs forever, unless you're a woman. Breaching the charter, breaching Section 35 rights, Aboriginal treaty rights, which guarantees equally to men and women. And UNDRIP guarantees every single international human rights protection equally to men and women. So there isn't anything that isn't being denied to these First Nations women and children right now. And we don't get a break. Just because I'm registered, it doesn't mean we get to sit back and say, oh, look, the problem's solved. I'm here today because my grandkids won't be registered and they won't be allowed to be a part of my community. And Canada's doing that knowingly, just like it underfunded foster care, knowingly, knowing that that was the root cause of the disproportionate apprehensions. And so we have to put that on the table and say, stop it. Stop this intentional destruction of our communities.
Thank you, Dr. Palmer. Senator Arnott.
Well, thank you, Chair. I really want to say I'm very impressed with the witnesses here today. They've been clear, concise, and very compelling, and their recommendations are really well considered. It seems very clear that the Government of Canada is, in fact, thwarting the rights and the intention and the spirit and intent of the Act by failing to fund properly the implementation of that. And it seems that it's a lack of at least small political will to do it properly. I'm surprised, really, that the second generation cutoff issue has not been addressed. It was certainly the issue that was clearly criticized in Bill C-31, and I'm surprised by that. I would have this question, though, to the panel, but in particular, Shelagh Day, because I agree with the recommendations and we need to act, this committee needs to act. But I would say this, with respect to communication and education, which is critical to the application and the process, setting the foundation so people know, in fact, they have a right that is being thwarted. It seems to me, who should be doing that communication? Who should be designing the education and the communication? Who should be implementing that? You can't rely, it seems to me, on Crown Indigenous Relations or Indigenous Services. I would say that Indigenous organizations, certainly women, should be intricately involved in the design and the delivery of that education and that communication to the community to support the applications for reinstatement that are required. I'd like to know what the thoughts of the panel are on that issue.
Well, I'll just start, perhaps, Senator Arnott. I completely agree with you, and it's what we've said all along. It should be designed with, in particular, Indigenous women's organizations, a campaign, a public campaign, We've also said to Minister Haidu that we believe in our goals and timetables, which we'll certainly share with the committee, that we believe that there should be a notice sent out through all the universal communications that the Government of Canada engages in. Income tax notices, OAS notices, CPP notices, things that go to every household or to most households, because a lot of the people that we think are newly eligible are not necessarily connected to bands or necessarily to Indigenous organizations. And so it's really important to reach them where they are. I would say, from speaking for myself, one of the things I would really like to see, I would like to see the Prime Minister of Canada go to the public and say, look, this is the history. This is what we've done. We're now trying to reverse this. And I want you to know that there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of women and their descendants who are now eligible for status. And we want you. We want you. Please come forward. We're making this process available so that you can come forward. That's the kind of message that I think women and their descendants need to hear. It's also the message that I think Canada needs to hear. So there are layers to this, how it can be done.
And I would just add, oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead, please.
Okay, and I would just add that we actually advocated strenuously to have Indian registration declared an essential service for this very reason, so that First Nations women and children would not be left out during a worldwide crisis. We asked over and over and over again, and they refused. And there's nothing stopping them. Like, think of all of the federal government notices all over Canada during the pandemic about get your shot, you know, commercials, information, like everywhere. Why couldn't they do that? I mean, they have the power at the same time as funding First Nations women organizations, friendship centers, cultural centers, and First Nations to provide education as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a follow-up question, Chair. I want to ask the panelists, it seems to me one of the fundamental problems is that we are not holding the executive branch of government to account. And so I'm asking this question to the panelists. Do you believe there needs to be a more effective accountability mechanism available to Indigenous people in Canada to hold the executive branch of government into account? And a model that I might put forward is something along the lines of the Auditor General model, which would report directly to the Parliament of Canada and bypass the executive branch of government on reconciliation, on the TRC's call to action, on the murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls calls to justice, on UNDRIP and its implementation, and importantly, the treaty relationship and the treaty implementation in a modern context. It seems to me that without that kind of accountability, we're just going to slide into litigation, non-action, and more problems. But I really want to hear the panel on that.
You want to go, Sharon?
I was just going to say, go ahead, Pam.
Oh, I think that's incredibly important. Part of the problem we have is the secrecy of information. When I was doing my doctorate on sex discrimination in the Indian Act, I made access to information requests over and over and over again. Some of them were denied. I had to appeal to the Office of the Commissioner, our Information Commissioner, and it's to get this information. And that's for me, particularly looking at it. What information flow or source is there for the public, like the Auditor General, like the Office of the Correctional Investigator, for example? Do you think any Canadians would know anything about what's happening from prisons if it weren't for the social justice activists on the outside and the Office of the Correctional Investigator on behalf of Canada saying, here's what's going on. I mean, people listen when the Auditor General says, hey, you're not dealing with water on First Nations reserves very well. And so imagine if every year we got a report on, and here's what you're not doing to stop discrimination against First Nation women and kids, and here's what you're not doing to help them on all of these fronts, including genocide. I mean, including all of these really big things that just seem to take a backseat to everything else. And so I agree with you. And recommendations have been made, in fact, to the National Inquiry. And the National Inquiry did make a recommendation that there be a similar accountability body with regards to the human rights of Indigenous peoples. I endorse that. I think that's the only way to have a comprehensive look at everything that they're doing and not doing, regardless of political party, but literally the government, what they're doing and not doing and what needs to be done, so that we don't have to keep going to the UN to do that for us, because that's what we do right now. We use the United Nations and the Inter-American Commission to say, here's what's happening, here's what Canada's not doing, so the UN can report back and say, Canada, you're not doing this, stop doing this, and then we just keep doing it. But Canadians don't really have access to that information under the UN. An Auditor General or Ombudsperson of some sense would make it wide.
Thank you, Dr. Palmer. The time for this panel is now complete. I wish to thank Ms. McIvor, Ms. Day, and Dr. Palmer for meeting with us today. We'll now suspend the meeting briefly to allow us to switch panels. I would like to now introduce our next panel of witnesses. The Honorable Lillian Dick, former Senator, Cora McGuire Surrett, Executive Director of the Ontario Native Women's Association, and Adam Bond, Manager of Legal Services, Native Women's Association of Canada. Former Senator Dick, Ms. McGuire Surrett, and Mr. Bond will provide opening remarks of up to 5 minutes each. We will then move to a question and answer session of approximately 4 minutes per senator. Please note that I will let witnesses know when they have 30 seconds left on their allocated time. I ask senators who have a question to use the raise hand feature on Zoom to signal this to the clerk. They will then be acknowledged in the chat. A reminder that committee members will be given priority to ask questions. A warm welcome to the Honorable Senator Dick, who is our former colleague and chair of this committee. Lillian, it's good to see you. I now invite you to begin your opening remarks.
Good afternoon. It's really wonderful to be back here, and with apologies to the translators, I sent you a copy of what I was going to say, but it's much, much too long, so I'm going to have to cut it back. I'm, of course, used to the speeches in the Senate, where I had up to 14 or 15 minutes. You know, it's been almost 5 years since the Bill S3 was passed, and so I had to dig back in my files and reacquaint myself with the information, and it's been quite challenging. And what I would like to do today is to give you some context about the bill, to do a brief summary, to comment on the two outstanding issues, and to make some concluding remarks. But first of all, I would like to say that often, these days with reconciliation, we do a land acknowledgement. So I would say I'm located in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is situated on land that is part of Treaty 6, where Treaty 6 First Nations lived, and it's also part of the traditional homeland of the Métis. And as was said before, Parliament is situated on the unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples. But I think we need to reconsider these type of acknowledgements. And after listening this morning to the powerful testimony of Sharon, McIvor, Shelagh Day, and Pam Palmer, I think we also, in their reconciliation, we should be acknowledging the following, and I'm going to shorten it. Acknowledging that the land which constitutes Canada has been taken from the original Indigenous inhabitants, and that the colonial and patriarchal practices of Canada have created numerous injustices which have severely harmed First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples. I think we should also acknowledge that the harm
Sorry, Senator
done.
Dick. We're having
Yes.
problems with translation. We just have to suspend for a second.
Okay. Okay. I was trying to tell the committee that today we should acknowledge in our reconciliation remarks that the land which constitutes Canada has been taken from the original Indigenous inhabitants, and that the colonial and patriarchal practices of Canada has created numerous injustices which have severely harmed First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And I would add that we should be acknowledging that the harms done to Indigenous women are different in nature than that was done to Indigenous men. And in particular, today, we should be acknowledging that there were harms done to Indigenous women by the federal governments over many, many decades by taking away their Indian status, and in a process which Pam Palmer has called today forced assimilation. And I particularly like the suggestion that the apology for this should come from the federal government through the Prime Minister. So I think that's a way of acknowledging that the past discrimination against Indigenous women by taking away their status is severe, and things need to be done. Now, with regard to the context for Bill S3, I'm going to give you a very brief snapshot of the legislative history to give you an idea of how long this has been going on. It was in 1869 that the Gradual Enfranchisement Act revoked Indian status from Indian women who married on non-Indian men, but Indian men who married non-status women did not lose their status. In 1876, the Indian Act granted Indian status to these non-Indian wives. And in 1951, the Indian Act was amended to revoke the status of adults whose paternal mothers and paternal grandmothers were non-status. And this is known as the double mother rule. And as been mentioned before, under Bill C-31 in 1985, a case spearheaded by the UN case initiated by Sandra Lovelace Nicholas, Indian status was restored to Indian women who lost their status by marrying out, and her children were granted status. There were two categories of status created, 6-1 and 6-2, and the second generation cutoff of status was created and is still operational today. And in 2010, under Bill C-3, grandchildren of Indigenous women who lost status by marrying out were granted eligibility for status. In both cases, the government knew there were outstanding registration issues that should have been addressed, but they did not do that. Now, when you come to Bill S-3, it was received in the Senate in October 2016, and it became very clear early on that the bill did not remove all sex-based discrimination as the government witnesses had claimed it would do. So APPA very soon decided that we would suspend study of the bill, that we would do everything possible to ensure that what was called the 6-1A all the way amendment was enacted, and we were able to fulfill that promise by diligent work by the committee and by agreement by the Senate as a whole. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Now, with regard to the two outstanding issues, this has been addressed by the previous speakers, the first one being the registration issues. The major objection by the government to removing the 1951 cutoff date, which would then restore status of descendants of Indigenous women back to 1869. They were afraid that hundreds of thousands of newly registered status Indians would be created and that this would overwhelm the individual bands and create a huge financial drain for the federal government to provide resources for the new status Indians to fund non-insured health benefits, to provide post-secondary education support, and so on. As was said before, the department expected 270,000 to up to 450,000 applicants to apply, but only a small fraction of that estimate have been received so far. Now, according to the final report on the implementation of Bill S-3 released in December 2020, only about 28,000 applications had been received, and only about 10,000 have been successful in gaining their status. And I might just add for context that after Bill C-31 was enacted, 13,000 descendants of Indigenous women gained status, and under Bill C-3, about 10,500 were registered. So I had to ask myself, why have there been so few applicants? And the previous speakers have addressed this. Part of the answer might be because the modeling data was significantly flawed and really vastly overestimated the potential numbers of new registrations. It's also possible that the goal of assimilating us into mainstream society succeeded, and perhaps many with matrilineal roots in the pre-1951 era have no interest in reclaiming their Indian status. But I suspect that a significant part of the low application rate is due to the complexity of the bill and how opaque it is. It's very difficult to understand and very difficult to explain in plain language. I looked at the information on the ISC website. It was not helpful. It was either vague, or when I looked at their diagrams and the text that accompanied it, and this is it here, probably can't see it. There's some little triangles. I looked at those, and basically, two of them I could not understand. And like I've been through this bill many, 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 many times, and I looked at this and I thought, If I can't understand it, and I have reviewed this and understand it, I thought inside out, then how is someone in the public who has no formal knowledge of it going to figure out what it is they're trying to get at? So the messaging is nowhere near clear enough. It's nowhere near simple enough that anybody on the street can understand if they're eligible to apply. And why isn't it done that way? I suspect it's because they have not bothered to sit down with Indigenous women. They have not bothered to sit down and test drive their messaging with people from the local communities. They haven't gone to the friendship centers to, ask what their opinions might be on this message. Do they understand what they're trying to get across? Are they working with local First Nation communities that are nearby, like Kitigan-Zibi? Could they not go out there and test drive their messaging? The public messaging, as has been said by the former panel members, is nearly not good enough. They really need to get the message out there. That might be a key way of getting more descendants to apply. Now, the second outstanding issue is the removal of any remaining sex-based discrimination. During our study, several witnesses, Leaf, Pamela Palmater, David Schultz, and the Indigenous Bar Association, listed examples of situations where there was still sex-based discrimination in qualifying for Indian status. Has the government looked at those? Is the government going to address those? I would ask Indigenous Services Canada and Justice, how are they identifying any remaining sex-based discrimination? Are they just looking at the court cases, which is really a very long, involved process to do it? Are they taking a proactive approach by examining amendments that have already been put forth, such as suggested by the witnesses I just listed? Are they examining the unfair clauses in the 1951 Indian Act? They're laid right out there. All you need to do is look at them. Like it's not that difficult. So are they doing that? They already have a lot of information, and it has been pointed already. Bill C-15 has been enacted. So Indigenous Services Canada and Justice should be committed to achieve gender equality in the Indian Act rather than their past practice of trying to delay or limit equality for Indigenous women. Now, I'm probably gone past my time here, Chair.
Yeah, it's, yep.
And I
Do you
would
want
just
to just
conclude
wrap up,
by
Senator Dick?
I would just conclude by saying APPA has played a very good role. I'm confident that APPA will continue to do so. And I would emphasize again what the previous speakers have said. Loss of status is not a trivial issue. It's really important to the health, safety, and well-being of the descendants of the women who lost their status. And I would like to put in something positive. I think we need a new word to describe what is happening to Indigenous women because of the operation of sexism and racism. And the new word would be misogyny, misogyny against Kwe, which is the Algonquin word, Ojibwe word for woman, and very close to the Cree word for woman, which is Isqueo. We need to focus on the unfortunate, unique circumstances that oppress Indigenous women. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Senator
Sorry
Dick.
it took so long.
Thank you, Senator Dick. I'll now invite Ms. McGuire-Surrett to begin her opening remarks.
Thank you. Baju Wawaganikwin Indigenous Cause Makwana Dodam Bingwani Ashi Anishinabek. As the Executive Director of the Ontario Native Women's Association, the oldest and largest Indigenous women's organization in Canada, ONWA has a history supporting Indigenous women who have suffered from gender-based discrimination with the Indian Act for the past 50 years. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the bravery, wisdom, leadership of numerous Indigenous women that have fought the battle to addressing the racial and gender-based discrimination within the Indian Act. Without them, we would not be here today continuing the advocacy. I'll be framing my presentation today based on two key priorities or 2 key points. And while I do not have the time today to explore in depth, it is imperative that they are kept in mind while we continue. First, Indigenous women have human rights. The fact that Indigenous women continue to be overrepresented within all systemic issues here in Canada is evidence that Indigenous women have a unique and devastating experience with colonization in Canada that continues today, as we are no longer seen as sacred, but rather a burden to society. UNWA advocates that an Indigenous gender-based analysis must be applied to all federal, provincial, territorial decision-making. Second, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People applies to Indigenous women, both at an individual level as well as the collective level. For instance, Article 18 of the UNDRIP affirms that Indigenous people have the right to participate in decision-making matters through representatives chosen by themselves as well as in our own institutions. From this, UNWA asserts that it is fundamental that Indigenous women have a right to their own agencies. Over the years, UNWA has engaged with Indigenous women on the Indian Act. It's clear that the Indian Act continues to negatively impact Indigenous women and girls at a systemic level. We recognize that unfortunately, the Indian Act is now connected to our identity and the right to belong to our communities, nations, and families. In 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People identified key actions for change, which included that healing must take place first for nation building and self-government to be successful. Additionally, it spoke to the need to restore Indigenous women's voices, expertise, and participation within decision-making at both political and social levels. UNWA's Reconciliation with Indigenous Women, Changing the Story of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls 2020 report provides clear recommendations for change. Our report is based on 50 years of listening and engaging with over 5,700 Indigenous women, and this report continues to not be included within the federal pathways nor the National Action Plan. Our report speaks to that we cannot restore our communities and nations without addressing the systemic issues that we as Indigenous women continue to face, which includes the restoring of our roles and responsibilities within our communities and the need for substantial investments into Indigenous women's healing and safety as part of addressing the residual discrimination from the Indian Act. Our recommendation number 6 is the restoring of Indigenous women's inherent rights. The Indian Act has disrupted our value system and has been replaced with patriarchal values that continue to exclude Indigenous women. In 2016, the federal government established a nation-to-nation policy and chose for their nation-building partners only 3 national Indigenous organizations. This policy discriminates against Indigenous women and girls, and it does not recognize us as legitimate partners. The majority of Indigenous women and girls live off reserve and continue to face violence 365 days a year, all across Canada, both on and off reserve. As I conclude, I will highlight 4 essential recommendations. First, the Government of Canada must implement a nation-to-nation plus framework that includes meaningful engagement with Indigenous women and invest in our agencies in the development of any federal policy and funding formulas. This is inclusive of all Indigenous women and their agencies in communities, not limited to only national Indigenous organizations, as the majority of agencies are not connected to national Indigenous organizations. Put the appropriate investments into the implementation of the registration of women and their children under S3. Indigenous women were told by Indigenous Services Canada that completing the application process for status could take up to 3 years. For some elders, 1 year may be too long to wait. Complete the remedy of sex discrimination as was identified in the case of Sharon McIvor versus Canada decision from the United Nations Human Rights Committee. Only one part of the remedy has been implemented, as you've heard today. It's essential that you also address the residual discrimination within communities with immediate investments in healing. Without it, Indigenous women and their families who have their status reinstated will continue to experience challenges and hardship. Finally, develop a strength-based education campaign for First Nation communities and for women who want to apply. We know that this legislation was not well received by all First Nations. The significant challenges that some First Nations face in caring for their current membership means that return of new members is seen as an undue hardship. In closing, I encourage the committee to review our Reconciliation with Indigenous Women's report in full, as it provides a roadmap of the restoring the balance needed in our communities. Miigwech for your time today.
Fire Surratt. I will now invite Mr. Bond to begin his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair and Honorable Senators. My name is Adam Bond. I'm the Manager of Legal Services at the Native Women's Association of Canada. I'm currently located in the municipality of Saint-Étienne-de-Gras in Quebec, the traditional territory of the Atacamic. I should confess, I wasn't aware that my time was going to be limited to 5 minutes. So rather than try and motor through the text that I had provided, I will just cut out as I go as best I can. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to appear today as part of your review on the implementation of Bill S3. NWAC is currently in the process of finalizing its final report on the effectiveness of Bill S3 and remaining issues under the legislation. As such, I'm not in a position to provide any final official positions or recommendations from the organization yet. It's coming in a few weeks, but I will be able to speak to some of the issues related to the implementation of the bill, some of the successes, the challenges, and the ongoing issues. I hope to make 4 points. The first is that Bill S3 has largely been effective in addressing the issues that the legislation was designed to address, and that the government has achieved some important successes in the implementation of the bill. Second, that despite these successes, there are ongoing challenges. Third, Bill S3 did not address all of the issues of inequality under the registration provisions. And fourth, the Indian Act is very likely fundamentally incompatible with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. To my first point, Bill S3 has largely addressed the issues it was designed to address, and the government has had some progress. For instance, the sex-based distinctions related to the cousins issue, the siblings issue, and the omitted minor child issue have been removed, and the 1951 cutoff date has been removed. With respect to implementation, Indigenous Services Canada has worked with stakeholders to promote awareness of the legislation, including NWAC. They have, as of mid-March, they had processed 85% of the 45,000 applications they had received under S3 to date. We welcome the reduced processing times and encourage the government to move further to enhance these service standards as quickly as possible. This is a significant area of frustration for many applicants. To my second point, despite these successes, there are many challenges that persist. So, despite the engagement and communication works that Indigenous Services Canada and national Indigenous organizations such as NWAC have implemented, there's still quite a bit of confusion about the registration provisions. This has something to do, as it has been touched on earlier, with the difficulty to follow these provisions. They're very complex and complicated. They refer to pre-1985 sections of the Act that are not publicly available, so it's hard to even understand what they're referring to. And it also requires applicants to have a very thorough knowledge and understanding of their own genealogy. Also, the government continues to maintain a burden of proof in matters of unknown and unstated parentage of balance of probabilities, despite subsection 5.6 setting out that the burden of proof in such matters is every reasonable inference in favor of the applicant. To my third point, there are pressing issues of equality that persist in the registration provisions. I'll go through as quickly as I can, but some of these include the age and marital status-based distinctions under paragraph 61A3. This is resulting in siblings from the same parent born after and before April 16th, 1985, being differently entitled to status for no other reason than their age or the marital status of their parents. Second, the second generation cutoff has disproportionate adverse effects on single mothers in particular. The next point, the expansion of entitlement under Section 6 raises issues about identity and belonging. There are many newly entitled individuals under Bill S3 who have been removed from their Indigenous cultures for generations. So resources and supports for these communities are needed so that that women and their descendants can be reconnected with their communities. The voluntary enfranchisement was not addressed by Bill S3. quote unquote voluntary enfranchisement. And the Indian Act does not allow individuals to deregister. My final point, the Indian Act is very likely fundamentally incompatible with the UNDRIP Act, regardless of any adjustments that might be made to these provisions. The coming into force of the UNDRIP Act creates a legislative conundrum. That act requires the Government of Canada to take all necessary measures, working in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the Declaration. Just one example, Article 33 of the Declaration codifies the right of Indigenous peoples to determine their own identity and membership, whereas the registration provisions of the Indian Act establish de facto controls over entitlement to First Nations membership. Yet, the Indian Act does also protect important rights and entitlements that are guaranteed to First Nations. No matter the adjustments to the registration provisions, the federal legislation applying pan-Indigenous rules to membership in First Nations is simply not compatible with the Declaration. While amendments to address the issues of ongoing inequalities are important for the short term, Canada needs to turn its mind towards working with First Nations to prepare a roadmap for the repeal of the Indian Act in such a way that the rights and entitlements of First Nations are recognized and protected. The colonial legislative scheme is abolished. This concludes my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. We'll now begin the question and answer session, and we'll begin with Deputy Chair Christmas, if he has a question. And if you could, just limit your questions to one for this round, where time is of the essence, and then we'll get a chance, we'll go to another round. Senator Christmas, followed by Senator Pate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, panelists, for joining us this afternoon. I want to give Senator Dick the opportunity to elaborate on our second point. As you remember, Senator, when we were discussing guest 3 in committee, we made the choice of going with an amendment that was called 61A all the way, which we were hoping would eliminate all sex-based inequities in the Act. And you'll recall quite clearly how the House of Commons rejected our amendment, but when the bill came back, you were most strong. And I want to thank you for that, for standing up to the House of Commons and insisting that the S3 bill would respect 61A all the way. In your second point, you had mentioned that not all sex-based discrimination was removed. Senator Dick, could you elaborate 5 years now after the fact? What do you see in S3 that you see as the inability of the S3 bill to remove all sex-based discrimination?
You're on mute, Senator Dick. You're muted, Senator Dick.
Thank you. I guess you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Yes, it's good to see you, Senator Christmas. It's been a long time since I've looked at that. But if you look at the witness testimony from LEAF, from Pam Palmer, David Schultz, and the Indigenous Bar Association, they do have a list of what they saw as the outstanding or residual issues that need to be addressed. Some of those, I think, were included in the bill, but not all of them. And in fact, apparently the government is planning legislation this summer to address voluntary enfranchisement. And this is a case where I believe it was a father who voluntarily enfranchised so that his children would not be taken away to Indian residential school, because his children would no longer be status Indians. So there were voluntary enfranchisements, and in some cases, the children were enfranchised or lost their status, and as adults, they maybe don't want to have that done. So that kind of enfranchisement where, and I think, for example, there could be cases where a husband has enfranchised, and then consequently his wife would be enfranchised. So that would be taking away her rights to be in control of her own status. So there still are those kinds of issues. But I really do think too, if you look at those examples given by previous witnesses, and also if you go back to the 1951 amendments, it does lay out exactly what the restrictions were. You don't need to wait for the court case. Just go back to the actual amendments in the Indian Act and look at them and get rid of them.
Thank you, Senator. If I can ask the same question to Mr. Adam Bond. Mr. Bond, you also mentioned the second generation cutoff and the age and marital distinctions that were causing further discrimination. Can you elaborate on those 2 points?
Yeah, the second generation cutoff on its face appears to be non-discriminatory because it's not in the language of the legislation that there's a distinction on the basis of sex. It's in the discriminatory effects that women are being discriminated against. And there is some discussion about this in the Gell decision, the Ontario Court of Appeal, and it's about either the different burdens or the different risks that a Indigenous woman, a single mother, for instance, might face having to or wanting to register her child. It can, unfortunately, in some circumstances, put women at risk, either economically, socially, or even for their physical safety. This relates to identifying status fathers of the applicant child. This issue also is important to the unknown and unstated parentage policy, as I alluded to earlier. There is the government is maintaining its position that the standard, the burden of proof in such cases is balanced probabilities, whereas a simple reading of subsection 656, it's clear that Parliament indicated something lower than that. And then the discrimination under the paragraph 61A3. This this is right on its face. This is clear, and we've heard from many people who have been directly affected. Many people. So what you'll have is an individual, an older sister, for instance, who was born in 1983, to parents who were never married, and at some point along the genealogical line, they had become entitled under 61A1 or A2. And so on that, this individual will be entitled to status. They will have a younger sister born in 87, for example. They will not be entitled to status under 61A3. They will be entitled to status under 61 or under 62. This is a difference in entitlement status based off of their age and the marital status of the parents.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Christmas. Senator Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us. It's wonderful to see all of you, and in particular, wonderful to see you back, Senator Dick. I want to pick up on something that was raised in the previous panel and that you raised, Ms. McGuire, so that the impact of the delays and the failure of the government to provide information to communities is that not only is it delaying registration, but the government is saving money as a result of that. In addition, communities are signing on to other agreements based on their current registration status, which then it actually encourages discrimination within the community, if you will, in terms of lateral discrimination to try and prevent women from then and generations from being registered. And it strikes me that this, as I think it was Dr. Palmer talked about, is a form of unjust enrichment that we've seen in other places, First Nations Caring Society case, others. And in the end, there needs to be compensation, it strikes me. But I'm curious what you think this committee should recommend in terms of potential remedies to address this and ways forward out of this situation that would assist Indigenous peoples and not further jeopardize their situation and not further unjustly enrich the federal government.
Thank you. Yes, what's needed is investments in healing today. You know, if we don't, we're already investing in Canada, but the investments that are going into Indigenous women, as you know, for instance, within the justice system, you know, where it's currently costing, I don't remember what the numbers are, like $250,000 to $400,000 a year to house an Indigenous woman within the justice system, where we're now currently over 50% represented there. That's not even including the amounts for child welfare, and especially if children have a disability and the costs going in there. So the investments that the federal government is currently putting towards Indigenous women is within definitely discriminatory practices, and there is no reconciliation for the harms done for Indigenous women here. And so that's really what we need to start looking at, is investments into specialized healing for Indigenous women. And because, as you know, colonization has affected us differently. You know, it was mentioned through the TRC, with Justice Murray Sinclair spoke to the violence that girls experience within the residential school system, right through to the Indian Act, and now missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. You know, human trafficking, for instance, and it continues. So if we don't start to actually invest into healing programs and services, our children are going to be having to continue this advocacy. And so that's where we need to begin, is investments into healing and safety
Senator
immediately.
Dick, Senator Dick, do you?
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear the last comment.
Oh, I was just asking if you had a comment on terms of what this committee could be recommending in light of the unjust enrichment and the situation that the Canadian government is exacerbating at this time by failure to act.
Well, failure to act really is just a continuation of the discrimination, right? And it's been a long-standing tactic used by every level of government, every political party. It isn't just liberals or conservatives. It's every government, that there is no political will, and by not doing anything, you're actually being complicit in continuing the disadvantage to Indigenous women. And I think that now that the bill C-15 has been passed, encouraging the government to fully implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that can be used as a reminder that the federal government has committed itself to removing all inequities with respect to Indigenous people and women, including women. So that is a tool that the APPA committee did not have when we were dealing with Bill S3, because C-15 had not yet been enacted. But we did rely upon the UN decision from the Human Rights Committee, UNHRC, with respect to Sharon McIvor's case, where they did rule that Canada had contravened the gender equality rights, and then gave Canada, I think it was a 60-day or something deadline to remove that discrimination from Bill S3. I hope that was helpful.
So would you think we should be making a recommendation for immediate compensation in addition to the registration requirements that the previous panel suggested?
You know, the tricky part is they built into the bill the clause that said there is no liability, right? How do we get around that? I do believe there should be compensation, but in that bill and in the previous bills, certainly in C3, there was this no liability clause, and I suspect it probably was also in Bill C31. But perhaps that clause could be challenged as well, saying that is a discrimination or unconstitutional. So maybe that's the way around it. But certainly there should be compensation. You know, when I think back in my own case, I didn't get my status back until I was 40 years old. And, you know, so there were a lot of health benefits that would have been very useful to me as growing up, particularly as a child. And so perhaps my health today would be better. I could have had dental benefits. I would have better teeth now, all those kinds of things. And they're not trivial. So if you don't have good dental care, you can actually end up with abscessed teeth, which then leads to heart problems, and you could actually die. And apparently, within emergency suites, a high number appear in emergency hospitals because of dental problems. So that's really creating a significant harm to people that don't have dental health care. And now the government is committed to instituting dental care based on income levels, right? For low income Canadians. If we can afford to do that, why can't we afford to compensate Indigenous descendants of Indigenous women who lost their status? It's a matter of priorities, well, of what your priorities are. And Indigenous women typically have not been high on the level of priorities.
All right. Thank you, Senator Dick. Senator Arnott.
Thank you, Chair. Well, thank you to the witnesses in this panel. My question or observation is for the Honorable Lillian Dick. Many people may not know, but Lillian Dick has been a champion for Indigenous rights, treaty rights, and human rights in Saskatchewan, and well-deserved. And certainly, she's been recognized to receive the Order of Canada, and rightly so. So I commend her for that. But Senator Dick, former Senator Dick, many people attribute the lack of support, the lack of will, the lack of understanding, and the lack of proper implementation of this bill, CS3, to cost, to the dollar amount. And I'm just wondering, is connecting the cost or dollar amount in the recognition and implementation of the rights of Indigenous women either correct, fair, or just in Canada in the 21st century?
You're on mute, Senator Dick.
It's not a fair position. And why is it that when it comes to Indigenous women, the cost always comes up? And in fact, what really got me is when we were studying Bill S3, the minister in the department said they didn't want to implement full implementation by a 6-1A all the way because they needed to consult with First Nations. But of course, that's not consulting with the people who are affected because they're going to the reserves, to people who are already registered. And in all other bills that we received, there was no lack of consultation. There was no consultation, I should say. And when the committee tried to ask them to do it, they refused. So that just shows you the kind of discrimination that goes. And it's always been used as an example. The Indigenous women are entitled. They're as entitled to being resourced as Indigenous men. So it's certainly not a fair comparison. And you could probably find within either the UN Declaration or in the Canadian Human Rights Act, you might be able to find clauses about, proper funding to equalize the funding between Indigenous men and Indigenous women. Certainly the equality rights are there, and they're also the equality rights of Indigenous women and men are in our Constitution under section, I forget, 35.2. I can't remember which particular section it is, but they're also in our Constitution as well as within our Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms.
I have a follow-up question, Chair, if there's time.
Okay, we'll come back to you, Senator Arnott, if there's time. This next question is on behalf of Senator Patterson to Senator Dick. I'd like to welcome Senator Dick back to the committee we worked on together for many years, and particularly on S3. It's great to see you again participating in our ongoing work. Both you and Shelagh Day emphasized the complexity of the application process, and if you couldn't understand that pamphlet accompanying the application process, then how could a person unfamiliar with the nuances and complexities of this issue feel comfortable? Ms. Day said it should be revamped.
Sorry, what was the last? I didn't quite hear the last part.
Okay. Ms. Day said that the application process should be revamped. It's very complex.
well, is the question, should the application process be revised and simplified? If so, yes, definitely. I haven't looked at the process itself, and certainly, Senator Patterson, you know more than the rest because you were deputy chair. And at the time that we studied this bill, you know how incredibly complicated it is. And listening today to Mr. Bond go through it, where we're talking about Section 61A C.1 and this date pre-1985, post-1985, you know, pre-this, pre-that, it's incomprehensible. You have to sit there with your pencil and translate as you go along. And the information that I showed you, you know, I really don't know what they're getting at. They really need to work with community members and say, you know, this is what we're trying to say. Is it getting through? And that's where I really liked working with my assistants in my office. I would say, well, this is what I think it means. What do you think? And then we would kept trying to simplify. You really do need people who are educators to translate it into language that everybody can understand. People that speech writers, professional communicators, because what we have now is probably produced by the department who are so used to their language, which I must say I think is deliberately confusing so that only they can understand what it's all about. And perhaps, I don't know, perhaps that is their reason to limit the number of applications. I would hate to say that is their reason, but clearly, even the department themselves, when they came to us, they would put things up on to show their graphs, and even they had mistakes. So something really needs to be done to simplify it and put it into plain language.
Thank you, Senator Dick. Senator Audette?
Merci.
Thank you very much. I will speak in French. Thank you to all these women who worked for decades to change the amendments, which, in my opinion, are the worst definition of systemic racism. Dear colleagues, Honorable Dick, do you think, yes, the system continues to create these discriminations? Do you think that within our communities, through lack of information, we end up believing that it's not really people who are welcome, so lateral violence is nourished, and organizations on the field like UNWA, the organization in Quebec, and those working with communities have a role, an important role to play to educate, promote, and inform. And from your experience as a senator and all the organizations that are here present as panelists, have studies been carried out showing that since 1985, communities have developed open membership systems that have been denied by the federal government, whereas those who adopted other restrictive membership codes were accepted by the federal government? And do you believe that the Abbey James Convention could be beneficial where one parent is required to transmit membership or status to a parent? Has it been reviewed by the Senate, by the federal government? Should that be a recommendation showing how men, women, open codes, and so on have been treated?
Thank you. You listed quite a few questions there. I don't know if I got them all down, especially the last one. I definitely do believe that the federal government, particularly Indigenous Services Canada and Department of Justice, I do believe there is a high level of systemic racism. And this was previously alluded to, I think, by Dr. Palmer, whereas there now is a court case by former employees in the oil and gas section of Indigenous Services Canada that are going to court over systemic racism against them. And certainly when you look at the resistance of the federal government to actually remove gender discrimination against Indigenous women, that is, to me, a very clear sign that it is systemic racism and sexism, as I said, as I termed it, misogynoquaism, specific discrimination against Indigenous women. It's part, sadly, it's part of our culture, and it's difficult to eradicate as long as the leaders continue to exhibit it. And certainly when we saw the witnesses from Department of Justice and from Indigenous Services Canada, when we were dealing with this bill, they were just so, I can't think of a nice word, but it was like they had the authority and they were just refusing to listen to what some of the witnesses had said, and just kept saying over and over about how great this bill was, despite evidence to the contrary. And to me, that's a clear symptom of systemic racism and gender discrimination together. And I do believe that organizations like the Ontario Native Women's Association, NWAC, and the Quebec Native Women have a role to play. And certainly during our study and press releases, we certainly did have press releases with members of those organizations to go to the media, to push the government to make it a public pressure in order for the government to follow through on their promises. And I must say that the Feminist Alliance for International Action, FAFIA, Sheila Day and her team were very effective in mounting a public education campaign. Now, I think you asked a question about membership, band membership in the different communities. I don't have access to that information. I don't know whether anyone's actually done that. I do know that there are sections under the Indian Act where bands can take over the authority to decide who is or who is not a band member. And I suspect, although I'm not positive, that probably in most cases, I think it's still up to the federal government through registry in the Indian Act, which we all know is not working. So bands could be losing out. And there were bands like the Odanak band that appeared where Stefan Deschanel was from, and I think the Yantha sisters. Some bands are seeing their numbers dwindle because of the second generation cutoff. And that's why they were in favor of opening the registry, because at some point in time, with second generation cutoff, the numbers will go down and you will have insufficient numbers to maintain your community.
Mr. Dick, the time for this panel is now complete. I wish to thank our witnesses for joining us today, and this meeting is now adjourned.